Good evening, traveller, and welcome back to the Unreliable Atlas. Each week, two tales are unearthed, one rooted in fact, the other spun from invention. Which is which? That's for you to decide. Before we descend, take a moment to subscribe, if you dare to keep wandering with us. And in the comments, tell us where you're listening from. Maybe you're huddled under polar bear blankets in the dead of Arctic winter. Maybe you're swinging in a jungle hammock, all wrapped up like a snack. Or maybe you're alone in a quiet room, or so you think. The Atlas leads us into forgotten towns, strange ruins, lost souls, impossible legends, places that slip between memory and shadow. Now, dim the lights, let the world grow quiet, and step with me into tonight's stories. Story 1. The Boy Who Ate France. True or false? Part 1. The Hungry Child. A boy was born around 1772, beneath the slow skies of the Rhône Valley, in a France not yet broken open by revolution. The Rhône then was a land of wine and grain, of calloused hands, of long days bent beneath the sun. Today it's remembered for its endless lavender fields, rows upon rows sweeping over the hills in soft violet waves, thick with scent, as if the very air had turned to perfume. And for the bold, peppery wines of Côtes du Rhône, dark, sun-warmed, full of stone and smoke. Painters would come later, drawn by the light. Van Gogh came more than a century after, in 1888, living not far in Arles, where the air shimmered like glass over wheat. But in the boy's time, painters were rare. Hunger was not. Narrow footpaths twisted through golden wheat fields. Farmers in sun-bleached linen tunics swung scythes in slow arcs. In the village, the air smelled nothing like the lavender fields. There it was must and river mud, tinged with the faint iron scent of horses. Some villages had no books, no paper, no ink, because no one could read. News came only by gossip, or from travelling men who sold stories the same way they sold thread and soap, loudly, and for coin. These men arrived in creaking wagons painted with saints and sons. They wore faded military coats or bright scarves from far-off ports and called out headlines like prayers. The death of a king. A woman who birthed a calf. A priest struck down by lightning. People gathered in tight knots around them, coins pressed in palms, children straining between legs to hear. One sow for truth, two for a lie that danced better. Some stayed the night, in barns or the corner bed of an inn, trading stories for soup. Others vanished by dusk, heading to the next village before their tales cooled. Most local gossip fermented in taverns, low, timbered places where smoke pooled like fog, and wine was poured from goatskin sacks into chipped clay mugs. There was cider thick with pulp and cloudy piquette, rose-tinged or brownish depending on the barrel, a sour wine made from leftover skins. Men hunched together over stews of onion and root. They licked grease from their knuckles, whispering what they'd heard, or what they wished were true. Some say the boy came from a small commune near Lyon, though no record survives, not of his baptism, nor of his name. A child of peasants, and the peasants of the Rhône lived as close to the earth as the roots of their vines. Their homes were built of wattle and daub, slender wooden slats woven into lattice, packed with wet clay, dung and straw until it dried like bone. The roofs sagged under mossy tiles. Chickens sometimes slept inside. A pig might live underfoot, grunting at the hearth, until someone brought the axe. By candlelight, those squat tapers of beef tallow, bitter on the tongue and smoky as sin, Children told stories of wolves in the forests, witches with blue fingers, and spirits who lived in the old wine barrels. The wolves were clever, they said. They walked on 2 legs when the moon was right. They took infants wrapped in linen, leaving only teeth marks in the snow. The witches lived at the edge of the marshes where reeds hissed and frogs fell silent. Their fingers were blue from cold or poison, and they whispered to birds who never sang again. And the barrels. Those held drunk ghosts, men who died mid-swig in the dark, slipping into lees and legend, still struggling as in life to crawl out of the casks. Sour, soaked, sealed in oak, not resting, not rising, just floating there, prune-skinned and pickled. Children played games with bones and string. They ran barefoot through soot-dark alleys, chased each other through smoke-thick streets, their laughter echoing off stone wells. It was a world lit by flame and ruled by appetite. While the boy's true name is lost, we know he had a nickname, a guttural corruption of the sudden bang made when a cork pops or a pot explodes, a word for rupture, for what happens when something can't be contained. But it wasn't the sound of his body breaking. It was the noise his hunger made when it finally touched air, like the snap of the world adjusting around a hole. They said his hunger began when he learned to chew, but others whispered that he'd screamed at the breast, that he clawed for milk and bit until blood came. Whatever the truth, by age 5 he could out-eat grown men. He devoured apples by the dozen, red Calville, Rainette du Canada, Belles de Boscoupe, sweet and soft-fleshed, sour and fibrous, fresh or spoiled. He'd climb orchard fences and vanish into the branches. The fruit disappeared down his throat, swallowed whole. He did not chew, he consumed, as if there were not a throat inside him, but a hole. He snatched loaves of rye and pan d'épi from windowsills, drank goat's milk straight from the teat, warm and foaming, until the goats kicked and screamed, licked grease from blackened firewood where meat had once dripped, bit into candles for the fat inside. And when no food was left, cats went missing, a short-haired mouser that earned its keep, a long-haired orange that wandered the alleys, a dog, or maybe a few. The stories disagree. But in the end, they vanished. And he did not. By 12, he could eat a quarter of a cow in a single day, nearly 90 pounds of flesh. A boy no thicker than a broomstick, seated beside the bones of an ox, eyes glazed, lips slick with marrow. Villagers brought scraps just to watch. It was spectacle, a grotesque curiosity. Still, his stomach was never quiet. After each feast, his belly swelled like a burial drum, round, stretched and tight. By morning it would shrink to a flap of empty hide, loose and wrinkled like an old wineskin. He sweated constantly. His skin reeked of rotting meat and vinegar. His breath was foul. His mouth hung open, drool spilling down his chin in ropes. His jaw seemed hinged like a snake's, and his teeth, chalky and cracked, looked as if they'd been worn down gnawing bone. People said he felt unfinished, that to look at him was to feel something in you resist. Not pity, not fear, just the knowledge that the mould hadn't set, that something had slipped out too early. His parents, broke and scared, sent him away before his 14th year. Maybe it was to save themselves. Others said it was to save him from what he might do. It's likely they gave him bread, a blanket, and locked the door behind him. Perhaps they warned neighbours not to let him in, or perhaps they simply vanished one morning, leaving him to find the silence. He was not the only child on the road. France's orphan count was high. Hunger thinned the birth rolls, and swollen bellies emptied out villages. Vagrants wandered from town to town, children in tow or alone, with tin cups and hollow stares. So he wandered. He was never seen twice in the same village, or if he was, the chickens disappeared. From farmhouse to vineyard, from barn to roadside ditch, he slept with pigs, he foraged for frogs and rats, he drank from slaughterhouse troughs, he learned which fish bones could be swallowed whole, he sucked marrow from roadkill and stole from shrines. These were simple shrines, often built beside paths or crossroads, stone ledges with iron bars, statues of the Virgin, ribbons pinned with prayers. Offerings were left, hard rolls, coins, cheese wrapped in cloth. Not out of wealth, but hope. He took them. He prayed, perhaps. Or perhaps he just ate. All around him, France starved. Grain prices rose. Famine rolled in waves. But the boy's hunger wasn't political. It was older, purer, closer to the worms beneath the soil. They say you could hear him coming, his stomach gurgling like distant thunder, or like something trapped, trying to get out. Part 2. The Spectacle. He wandered for years. No one counted them. Those years of alleys and hedgerows, wine cellars and pigsties. The world did not record boys like him, but in time he found a use, not as a son or soldier or student, but as a show. France has always loved its freaks, saints with stigmata, children born with second heads, women who bled on cue. In markets and fairs, people gathered to watch suffering dressed as spectacle. The thin line between horror and awe was just the width of a coin. The boy certainly had coins thrown at him, because all strange things, while feared, demanded value for their novelty in an otherwise bleak existence. Some say he began by dancing, barefoot on barrels, teeth clacking with castanets. Others say he only sat cross-legged on burlap sacks, staring into space until someone dared him to eat something. A candle, a rat, a pocket watch. And he did. He joined a troupe of charlatans, men with powdered wigs slicked to the skull, grease paint smeared on sagging faces. They called themselves physicians, philosophers, alchemists. One swore he could cure infertility with leeches. Another sold opium in bottles labelled vinegar of Saturn. They pitched tents striped in red and gold, with hand-painted signs hung crooked over rain-warped booths, each one louder than the last, each name more desperate to trap the eye. The Living Moor, the Swallowing Child, Monsieur Monstre, the Walking Void, Le Devour, the Ox-Eater, the Boy who eats fire and bone, France's Shame, France's Wonder, the Demon Gullet, the Flesh Pit in Pants, the Chewer of Candle and Cat, the Cask of Hunger, the Baby who ate his mother, the Swamp with Teeth, and always the same image. A painted boy, head tilted back at an impossible angle, mouth stretched wide, a whole pig, pink and screaming, vanishing past his teeth. He was billed as a marvel, a joke, a warning. They shouted his nickname, snapping it like a whip. The sound popped, hissed, drew breath. It was a bite of a word, and the crowd bit back. He ate anything they gave him. Cork stones, horseshoes, a live eel once, bitten in half, spine first. Handfuls of hot wax swallowed while still dripping. Coins, nails, a rosary. And he never choked, like a stone down an endless well. He is possessed, an old woman muttered once. He is punishment, said another. But the children laughed and pointed, and came back the next day. He lived off what the crowd gave him, coins when they were generous, scraps when they were not. He licked clean the paper wrappers of roasted lamb, sucked marrow from festival bones, chewed discarded wax fruit until his gums bled. He slept behind stalls, in piss-soaked hay, in the hollows of broken statues. He was not quite man, not quite animal, just open. People began to follow him, not friends, not family, but watchers. A woman in Le Puy claimed to have seen him swallow a dozen eggs whole. A boy in Dijon swore he saw the boy vomit a live mouse, then eat it again. One farmer accused him of sucking yolks straight from hens' nests, leaving shells so clean they looked sculpted. He rarely spoke. When he did, his voice was hoarse, scratchy, like wind through dead trees, not from shyness, but from something deeper, like words were a language his body no longer needed. But still, he performed. He let the crowd prod his belly. He let a midwife insert her hand into his mouth, up to the wrist. He let a butcher wager he could feed him a whole calf heart, raw. The butcher lost. Once, in Rouen, a doctor offered him 12 francs if he could eat his way through an entire apothecary's drawer. The boy opened his jaw and began. He did not get sick. He did not die. He did not thrive either. He just kept going. The body adapted. His stomach, a stretched organ, more sac than muscle. His throat, a lubricated tunnel, his jaw able to distend like a lamprey. His skin, loose enough to be gathered in fists tied in knots, or stretched over bowls. His lips blistered, his eyes yellowed, but he smiled, because smiling made the coins fall faster. Still, there were days the troupe forgot him, days he wandered alone, a boy with nothing but a tin cup, and a stomach that seemed to have its own set of teeth. Was it hunger or performance? He began to blur the line. At a midsummer fair in Clermont, he offered to eat a full basket of apples, a sack of onions, and a raw snake. Then, for the finale, he swallowed a sword hilt. Not the blade, just the hilt. It protruded from his lips like a handle. He turned in place, arms wide. They clapped. And then he collapsed. Later, they said his body expelled things like a grave digger vomiting secrets. Coins, teeth, a lace glove, a child's spoon. No one could say what was planted, what was sleight of hand. The truth didn't matter anymore. Only the show. But a show cannot live forever. By 16 or 17, the boy's body began to fail. He fainted often. His legs buckled, his breath turned foul enough to stun insects. He begged for eggs, for liver, for entrails, not as tricks, as food. The troupe left him, or maybe he left them. Either way, he ended up in Lyon, filthy, starving, shivering with fever, and collapsed in the doorway of a hospital. They took him in. And in that hospital, for the first time, someone looked at him not as a marvel, but as a patient. That is where the experiments began. Blackout. Part 3. The Experiment. He woke up in a whitewashed hospital room, strapped to a straw mattress. He smelled vinegar, bleach, the sharp reek of piss and pus and old blood. A woman was screaming while pushing out a baby in another room. Somewhere, a surgeon was singing. They let him eat. Bread, soup, meat, barrels of plums. Still, he starved. The doctors were fascinated. They brought him pails of entrails and offal. He drank blood from bowls. He chewed cow's stomach until it burst between his teeth. He begged for more. They weighed him before and after each meal. One surgeon, doctor, Corville said it was like watching someone fill a well with snow. The boy would eat and bloat like a drowned pig, then sweat, twitch, sleep. When he awoke, the hunger returned. Dr. Corville called his colleagues. Soon the wards were filled with students, surgeons, and old men with medals. They fed the boy up to 16 meals a day. Watching as his stomach rose like bread in an oven, they pulled open his jaw and stared down his throat. No answers came. When they cut him, his blood smelled sweet. When they weighed his shit, it came out nearly as fast as it went in. He was not digesting, he was transporting. So they began to test him. First, a live eel, slippery, black, coiled in a bucket. The boy grinned. He bit the head clean off, swallowed the rest whole. Then, a lizard, a snake, a small terrier. The dog squealed once. The doctors debated ethics, but the boy only watched, licking his fingers. They tested him with corks, stones, wooden spoons. He swallowed them all. Then, a wooden box. Inside it, a secret note, folded, sealed, and wrapped in waxed cloth. Could the boy be used to carry messages? Could he be a spy, a courier, uncatchable and unknowable? They gave him the box. He smiled, chewed once, swallowed. 3 days later, the box passed, intact. The note unread. The room went silent. One surgeon vomited. The boy laughed. His breath stank of bile and rust. He was sweating through the sheets, gnawing his own fingers. His stomach had turned black and blue. They fed him a golden spoon. He passed it 2 days later, gleaming. Part 4. The Mission. The army took him. It began as a favour. Doctor. Corville had friends among the generals and France was at war again. Revolution had spread like fire, enemies on all sides, spies everywhere. Our hungry hero was brought to a military outpost near Mainz. They gave him a uniform with brass buttons and a red sash. More costume than rank. They called him the courier, a secret weapon, a walking postbox, a stomach with legs. He stood among soldiers, sweating, trembling, mouth always slightly open. He could barely hold a musket, but that didn't matter. His weapon was internal. They fed him documents wrapped in oilskin, folded maps, messages laced with code. He swallowed them all. One night, they led him into the woods. The moon was red, the trees black with soot. He was given a final message, sealed, important, intended for a French colonel across enemy lines. He swallowed it, then walked into the dark, alone. They never trained him in espionage. They gave him no cover story. He couldn't read. He could barely speak German. He made it 20 miles before collapsing in a barn, begging for food. A farmer called the Prussians. They searched him, found nothing, held him in a cell for 2 days, waiting. Eventually he passed the package. They read the message. It was nonsense, a decoy, a test. The army had never intended him to succeed, but the Prussians were not amused. They dragged him into a forest clearing, bound his hands, prepared the noose. The boy wept. At the last moment, the rope was lowered. He was beaten instead, whipped, starved, mocked, then released. He stumbled back to the French lines, his uniform torn, his gums bleeding. Something inside him had snapped. When he reached the hospital, he begged the doctors to cure him. He said he would do anything. "I will stop eating," he told them. "Please, remove the hunger." They tried laudanum, vinegar, wine, a diet of soft-boiled eggs and salt-cured meat. He vomited it all. They fed him more offal. He licked the bowl. That night, a hospital patient went missing. A child. The doctors turned away, and no one spoke his name for a long, long time. Part 5. The end. They didn't expel him. They just stopped looking him in the eye. He was moved to the far end of the hospital in a separate wing, a former monk's cell where the windows didn't open and the walls bled salt. They brought food on trays and slid them through a hole in the door. Sometimes it wasn't food, sometimes it was a bucket of blood, sometimes a carcass left in a sack. No one wanted to touch him anymore. The nurses spoke of the smell, not the stench of unwashed skin or open wounds, or the meat he devoured raw. This was worse. Sweet, wet rot, like syrup poured over a corpse. He coughed through the nights. Spasms racked his chest. They opened him up. Dr. Tessier, who had replaced Corville, convinced him to undergo an exploratory surgery. The boy agreed, begging only for more laudanum. They found ulcers across his stomach, ringed in pus. His liver was blackened, his intestines distended and coiled like overfilled sausage. They said his esophagus was scarred with teeth marks. His own. The boy died the next day. They buried him behind the hospital, under a weeping cypress, in a grave marked only by a stone. Years later, when Tessier described the autopsy, he said, "No human should have endured such a body." And yet, he had lived. Until he didn't. That was the tale of the boy whose hunger knew no end. But the atlas never closes with a single page. Our next story drifts from hunger to the body itself, the girl born without bones. True or false? You decide. Part 1. The Island. She was born on a small island in the Seychelles in the 1820s, on an unnamed sand key within sight of Mahé. Most people lived on Mahé then. Pralan and La Digue held smaller settlements. The entire colony numbered only a few thousand souls, 6,000 to 7,000 by the middle of that decade, small enough that everyone knew the sound of everyone else's cough. The girl did not push into the world. She spilled, limp as seaweed, eyes already open. Her arms bent too far, her legs curled like wet rope. The midwife touched her chest and whispered that the bones were there, but soft, not done, like dough that needed more time in the oven. Her father saw her once. He stood in the doorway, silent, then walked down the beach. By nightfall, his canoe was gone. He was never seen again. At first, she lay in a wooden basin lined with cloth. However, wood swells and splinters. Months later, a trader's launch offloaded a tinned copper washtub, long and smooth. Her mother bought it. That bowl became the girl's bed, her bath, her sea. Although she was a normal-sized baby, she preferred to be folded, knees drawn up, arms tucked in. Her head and chest looked ordinary. Her pelvis was narrow. Her arms and legs were floppy and bendy, as if the rules that stiffen a limb had been forgotten. Freckles spotted her nose like rust on tin. Her eyes were pale sea blue and drank light. People who saw her remembered those eyes long after they forgot everything else. Part 2. Names and Daily Life. On the island she was given names. Tifi Sanzo, the little girl without bones. Zanfandello, the child of the water. Sometimes only the girl. Her mother was careful with her. Children still dared each other to touch the water in the bowl. They poked a forearm or a shin and jumped when the girl hissed faintly through her teeth. Not a threat. Proof of life. Each morning her mother scrubbed the single white cloth in seawater and ash and dried it stiff on a line. No buttons, no ties. She dressed her as you'd dress an altar. Plain, clean, renewed. Meals were soft things for a soft girl. Mashed yam and plantain. Fish broth strained twice through linen so no needle bones could catch. She loved yam with salt. She hated papaya. Papaya, to her, tasted like spoiled breath. It lingered, too ripe and too sweet, like something overripe hiding rot. On feast days she was given tamarind syrup on a finger. She closed her eyes when she tasted it, as if she were memorizing sweetness so it wouldn't escape. Bathing became ritual. The copper bowl was lowered into a larger wooden bath. The water warmed with stones from a cook fire. As the bath rose, her body floated up and out of the bowl, head supported in her mother's palm. Water poured slowly over chest and ribs and hips. Her floppy rubber limbs drifted in slow arcs, fragile as eelgrass. She looked most at peace then, freckles bright as stars, pale eyes half closed. Part 3. Watching. As she grew, she couldn't play, so she watched. She tracked ants carrying sand beneath the floorboards. She counted the breadth of the lagoon by wave and drawdown. She stared at the shadow mesh of nets drying in sun and how the pattern slid over the hut wall as the day turned. Her eyes became her hands. A glance meant wait. A longer glance meant again. A narrowing meant enough. At first, the other children mocked her. Later, they obeyed. They sat in a ring around the bowl and let her direct their games with nothing but looks and tiny sounds. When she finally allowed laughter, it came all at once, bright as birds shaken from a tree. Her voice was small and pressed through teeth. Wait. Again. Enough. When she spoke, people stopped without knowing why. Even the goats stilled for a heartbeat. She renamed the hours of the day. Before dawn was blue quiet. Noon was hum time. Evening was smoke hour. The family repeated her words until they forgot whose words they were. Part 4. Family. She had 2 normal sisters. They primped and changed into borrowed dresses to parade the lane at dusk. Later, when sailors and clerks were posted to Victoria, they powdered their throats and tucked flowers behind ears before small dances. The girl watched every comb stroke and ribbon knot like it was a lesson in architecture. Her sisters carried her in a sling woven soft and broad, 2 hands to her head, 2 to her hips. Never the arms, never the legs. Count aloud before each lift. They brought her close to hibiscus. She preferred the yellow. Red made her sneeze. They carried her to the reef at low tide, shading her skull with a palm leaf while she counted waves. They carried her to the goat pen, where she smiled faintly at the clatter of hooves on stone. She admired the height of people. When a tall fisherman ducked the lintel, her eyes followed him up and up as if he were a mast. Mostly she was quiet. But when a cousin grew tall one rainy season, the girl said, with a hint of pride, "Sky long." They learned her weight and her ways. They learned how a careless wrist could fold a bendy elbow the wrong direction. They learned patience by carrying her. But once they failed. Part 5. The accident. She was 11 when it happened. Both sisters lifted the sling. A heel slipped on damp clay. The sling pivoted, the copper rim canted. She spilled out. The sound was small, a shell striking another shell, making the ocean inside go quiet. She went still. Her mother bent close, desperate to find breath. There it was at last, thin, stubborn. The midwife arrived swift from the next yard, hands smelling of ash and bark. She cupped the thin skull with both palms and whispered into the soft spot as if a message could be pushed back inside. For 3 days the family kept vigil, dampening cloths, reading, waiting. The girl lay in the blue quiet and did not move. On the 3rd day she opened her eyes and spoke one word through her teeth. Here. The midwife called it a coma without the word. After that, rules hardened. No half counts, no wet ground, no lifts when wind shoved at the walls. She was carried as if time itself could be dropped. Part 6. Bread and books. The mother baked bread for a living. Loaves gone by morning to men who rode and clerks who tallied. The hut smelled of yeast and smoke from first light. The girl loved that smell. She could not bite bread unless it was laid in water to soften. Her sisters would break a heel into a tin cup, pour warm water, and feed her the sodden heart with a shell spoon. On days when flour was low, her mother would wet the crust and let her breathe the steam. Taste with your nose, she'd say, and the girl did. Books found her the way rain finds cracks. A clerk's wife lent a small French reader. A catechist brought a torn pamphlet. Sailors left almanacs with tide tables and thumbnail maps. She liked the parts about people moving, their energy, their battles, the way they built things that defied wind. Her favourite picture was a harbour stacked with masts like a forest, every line a height she could count. Her older sister read each night by lamp smoke. The girl held the tide tables and followed the rows of numbers with her eyes. Eel, vent, os, island, wind, bone. She repeated them until they smoothed into breath. The almanac maps showed reefs as dots and skulls and thin bars for prevailing wind. She said the wind lines looked like a person breathing. In, out, sleep, wake. She asked that a map page be tucked under her cloth when she slept. It warmed to her body and softened at the folds. Part 7. The Doctor. A French doctor came ashore in 1838 on a trading cutter that took soundings along the coast. White hat, leather case, salt in the seams of his boots. He expected fever, rickets, scurvy. Instead, he found a child who lived in a shining bowl. He examined her ribs, slight, but doing their one job. He pressed the chest and felt the lift under his palm. He traced the skull with 2 fingers and watched the skin thrum with pulse. He lifted an arm that folded like wet rope and set it down carefully, as if the limb might choose a different shape if he wasn't watching. Journal of Dr. Etienne Marot, 1838. The subject is female, approximately 11 years. Head and thorax of ordinary dimensions. Pelvis narrow. Limbs markedly hypertonic. Joints lax in all directions, giving an impression of bonelessness, though bone is present. Skull thinned. Pulsation visible. Ribs slight but functional, sufficient for respiration and cardiac protection. Vertebral column incapable of supporting the trunk. Speech is faint and dental, forced through clenched teeth, eyes lucid, affect calm. He listed his guesses: hyperphosphatasia, failure of mineralization, bones soft as wax, osteogenesis imperfecta, fractures in utero with distorted healing, congenital muscular hypertonia, muscle laxity that makes a body seem boneless. Sea goat syndrome, local term for infants born during high tide with limbs that flex in reverse. Latanier baby, named for the wind-warped palms, a child whose spine bends like fronds in storm. Jellybone feeblement, a planter's superstition, believed caused by twin curses, envy and salt. St. Elmo's pelvis, a sailor's diagnosis for unwalkable girls who spark strange dreams in men. The droop, not an ailment, merely a shrug passed down through generations of women too tired to fight the air. None fit entirely, he wrote, and underlined it twice. He tried splints of willow bound in leather, her bendy legs wrapped around them like vines. He tried a stiff collar for the neck. She gagged until her eyes watered. He took it off and apologized in a voice no one needed translated. He wrote again. The body refuses artifice. Spine offers no promise. Ribs are a miracle of just enough. Lungs persist, heart continues. A life maintained on the edge of insufficiency. Before he left, he said she would not see adulthood. He said her ribs were just enough. He said she would never bear a child. The mother nodded once and lifted the palm leaf higher over her daughter's head to keep off the sun. Part 8. Villagers. At first, people kept distance. Some made the sign against the evil eye. Some whispered that the father had walked into the sea for a reason. But the mother sold bread and didn't flinch. She scrubbed the step with brine. She smiled with flour on her forearms. She tilted the bowl so a neighbor could see the pale blue eyes looking back. Fear softened. Fishermen left a shell or a twist of rope near the door because it felt right. Women brought a square of muslin or a bit of ribbon with a pin in it. Small things that proved a person could be cherished for their own sake. A widower began to stop and recite the day's sky to her. High clouds, low clouds, a bruise of weather to the south. She learned to love storms through his mouth. There were nights she begged for lightning. She loved the flash and the god drum of thunder and the way rain galloped over the roof. When a squall strobed the lagoon, she breathed like a runner at the edge of starting. But fear came later, after a bolt struck a palm so close the hut shook and dead fronds fell like spears. After that, she counted the time between flash and crack with tight, thin breaths, and said enough when it grew too small. Part 9. The fading years. By 15, the pulse in her skull beat plainly beneath the skin. Strangers recoiled. The family learned to read it the way a sailor reads a weather glass. High when she was content. Frantic when the room grew hot. Shallow when sleep thinned. Her breath stayed small but faithful. Her head and chest still looked ordinary. Her pelvis stayed narrow. Her limbs remained floppy and bendy. A child's rope work that never hardened. She spoke less, but her words sharpened. Storms were drums. Thin days were bone light. Crowded huts were too much. She made a word for the quiet after rain that smelled of leaf and ash. She made a word for the blink before sleep. Her sisters used those words at market without noticing. The mother sometimes felt shame when people stared. How small the girl's world was. How public the bowl had made it. She felt pride when the girl's eyes pinned a person to the spot and made them gentle. The feelings met somewhere inside her and agreed to carry on. Part 10. The end. At 16, her breath rattled like tide in a cave. She opened her eyes only for moments. Her mother lowered the copper bowl into the wooden bath and lifted her as the water lifted her, the way she had since the beginning. Stones clinked against wood as cooling water was replaced with warm. Her sisters moved quietly. Bread rose under a damp cloth on the table as if the hut were breathing with her. Her last meal was yam with salt. The sisters softened a corner of bread in warm water and gave her the heart. She bit the spoon softly and left a faint crescent in the wood. Someone kept it. It still lies in a drawer that smells of rope and anise. The doctor had written years earlier, prognosis, unlikely beyond adolescence, end expected without struggle when ribs no longer suffice for the work of breath. It was exactly so. Her last breath sounded like a wave slipping between larger ones, the kind you only hear if you're listening for it. Some say she was buried in coral sand under a breadfruit. Some say the tide rose that night and carried the copper bowl through the door and into the lagoon, where it drifted past the reef and turned until it found the line of wind. Sailors, who love a better story more than a true one, later claimed a showman kept her in a jellyfish tank. On the island, they say she never left. Part 11, footnote. Old people still whisper her names. Tifi Sanzo, Zanfandello. They say her freckles look like sand flung from a wet hand. They say her eyes made you quiet. No one quotes the doctor now. They remember the hat, perhaps. The leather case. The way he stared too long. But his notes turned to ash. What stayed was the way the mother's hands moved under the head. The way the sisters counted. The way neighbours slowed their steps at the door. The lesson of her life remains. How to carry what cannot be dropped. How to move slowly enough that even the wind does no harm. How to make a world out of watching. This is not a grand story. It is a girl in a copper bowl. A mother's bread. Two careful sisters. A strip of sand off Mahé. And the sea breathing always near. Two tales, one true, one false. Which do you believe? Leave your answer in the comments below, and tell us why. We know many of you listen late at night, sometimes while trying to fall asleep. Tell us where you're listening from, and whether these stories kept you awake or gave you good dreams. And one more thing. If you know a rare or hidden place, a ruin, an old legend, or a forgotten town you'd like us to cover, share it in the comments. Your suggestion might become part of the Atlas. If you enjoyed wandering the forgotten corners of the Atlas, subscribe and join us again next week for another journey into the unknown.